Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending the session. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but such are the times we live in. But I'll try and make this as engaging as possible. I am Albert Boquet. I'm a professor of human factors and behavioral neurobiology at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking to you about factors associated with accidents in the helicopter EMS industry. And basically looking to see, are we learning anything? I first became interested in this area when I was a principal investigator at the FAA back in the early 2000s. When we first noticed that there were some problems. So what I'll do is go through some of the studies that we've done over the years and just kind of track how things have changed or have not changed in the industry with respect to accidents and safety in general. So a little bit of background first about helicopter EMS. We often heard about the golden hour in trauma and emergency medicine. And it initially referred to that reduction in morbidity and mortality that results from faster treatment being provided to trauma victims. And in fact, they actually said, the initial research stated that it was, 60 minutes was that critical time. And it was on the battlefield where that information came from. So we really learned in Korea and really in Vietnam how critical it was to get wounded soldiers to advanced treatment as soon as possible. The reality in civilian life is quite different, however. Studies have really failed to support that 60-minute timeline. Certainly, it's important we get to people quickly, we begin treatment quickly, but it doesn't have to be by air, and it doesn't even need to be at a hospital, quite frankly. And if speed is really what you're interested in, the myth that helicopters are faster than ground really isn't necessarily true either. In rural areas where we don't have access or ready access to ground transportation, that's true. However, once we get to urban areas and suburban areas, quite frankly, what we find is that it's faster to transport people on the ground because you don't have the checklist that you have to go through calling out the ambulance, and the distribution of ground transportation of ambulances in most cities is it's quite dense. And so you're usually very close to ground transportation in the event of an accident. Another issue that we have seen in helicopter EMS are what's known as inter-hospital transfers, where patients are transferred from one hospital to another. Seldom are these medically necessary. These are typically stable patients who are being transferred for different type of treatment and things like that. And the reality is, when you look at that risk-benefit ratio, it really doesn't justify shuttling by air. And in fact, the industry actually refers to those individuals as golden trout because you get to charge a lot of money for very little effort. So that has become a problem in the industry. So the real question here and why we're talking today is, why do medical helicopters crash? You'll hear a lot of different reasons from many, many experts, ranging from emergency medical physicians to pilots to FAA researchers. And I'm not going to say that what I'm giving you is, the gospel, but after studying this for over 20 years, I think I have a little bit of insight that I can offer. Some of the things you hear is that the data is sparse. When you look at it, there's not a whole lot of data on it. And if we compare timeframes, i.e. the 1990s to early 2000s to today, it's really kind of comparing apples to oranges. And there is some truth to that. We've looked at big data solutions. We've looked at institutional agendas, NTSB, FAA, industry. But the actual reality is that medical helicopters today are really crashing for the same reasons that they were in 2010, 2000, and 1990. So we really aren't seeing new reasons, in spite of the fact that we've really shown a spotlight on medical helicopter accidents for quite some time now. I'm going to go through some notable accidents here just to give you kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. So in Utah in 2003, we had an EMS helicopter crashed into terrain, what we would have called a CFIT, while maneuvering in dense fog on an aborted mission to pick up a patient. The pilot and a flight paramedic were killed, the flight nurse seriously injured. Texas in 2004, there was an EMS helicopter that crashed into terrain while maneuvering in reduced visibility conditions. All aboard were killed with the exception of the flight nurse, who was seriously injured. South Carolina, 2004, an EMS helicopter collided with trees shortly after picking up a patient. Pilot, flight nurse, paramedic, and patient were killed. In California, 2003, EMS helicopter en route to pick up a patient when it collided with mountains. And again, here operating in very high winds, very heavy rain, and all on board were killed, pilot, flight nurse, and paramedic. So here we have the early 2000s. Recently, we see in Ohio, 2019, there was a helicopter EMS flight that crashed in deteriorating weather, killing 3. The pilot was cited for inadequate pre-flight, poor weather evaluation, and substandard safety management system implementation. 2019 in Minnesota, HIMS flight crashed on approach to the hospital in fog and dark night conditions, 2 dead and 1 serious injury. In Alabama, we had a HIMS flight crash where the flight continued visual flight rules into instrument conditions. The pilot was not current or qualified for instrument flight. 4 people were killed in that one. And finally, in 2018, a HIMS flight crashed after aborting a flight and attempting to return to base. They had encountered mist, snow, and deteriorating conditions. Everybody on board was killed. So here you're kind of getting the theme that I'm talking about. You know, sadly, that the weather conditions, deteriorating conditions pose a big problem for helicopter EMS. And in reality, the vast majority of these are really not certified to fly in weather. They are what we call VFR, or visual flight rules systems. So they should not be flying in weather. They should not be flying into deteriorating conditions. And really, when we talk about crashes and hull losses, that's really the smaller part of the picture, because it really doesn't get to the human cost. In 2018, there was a $100 million verdict or award for a flight nurse who was burned in a HIMS accident. And this was in a pretrial settlement. $5 million and $21 million for trials in Alabama and Kentucky awarded to survivors and families. 2016, roughly $5 million for 2 accidents, one involving air methods for injuries, another for air trans for wrongful death, and $8 million for an air methods wrongful death. So the cost, the human cost of these accidents is quite high. And what I have here is just something that anyone can go and pluck this off of the internet. This is from US HIMS Safety. And this kind of gives a breakdown of the accidents over a period of time from 2006 to 2015. So roughly a 10-year time span. And in here, what we can see is that while from 2007 or 8, the accident fatalities have gone down, they've really remained fairly stable since then. So not much change in the accident, a little bit of change in fatal accidents. So what really kind of got people to take notice were the spike in statistics or the spike in accidents. So if you look at statistics between 1980 and 2002. In 2002, mining and agriculture, which are historically dangerous occupations, had death rates of 21.2 and 22.5 per 100,000 employees, respectively. The death rate for HIMSS workers is 192 per 100,000 employees. No doubt this is influenced by the small HIMSS population, but the reality is it's still a dangerous occupation today. The mortality rate for patients being transported, if you look at the comparison between that and surgical medical complications, 0.76 per 100,000 patients flown, compared with 1.2 per 100,000 for surgical and medical complications. So the real thing here is it's risky for the crew, but it's also risky for patients as well. And we're really there to help patients. So this should give us pause when we see something like this. So in addition to that accident rate, when we start looking at what kind of underlies that, number one, there's been a substantial increase in the number of HIMSS operations in the US. Today, we have, by any measure, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 EMS rotorcraft operations in the United States, transporting about 400,000 patients annually. The cost is $2.5 billion for transporting only 3% of the patients. So you can see there's a lot of money invested here in order to maintain the service. And what has really changed from the early 80s, really, if you look at the beginning of helicopter EMS, early on, when we had our first ones that are kind of forming up in the 1970s and 1980s, these were all what we would call our hospital-based operations, meaning that a hospital, large hospital typically, had a helicopter EMS operation that went out and served that hospital. So for them, it really wasn't in and of itself a money-making proposition. But once Medicare started paying, once insurance companies began paying for HIMSS flights, what we saw was a huge increase in standalone operations, and that is operations that exist solely to transport patients. That's the only way they make money. So we have to look at how much pressure do these operations have to fly. If that's the only way they make money, they have to pick people up and deliver them. In addition to that, we also look at the organizational oversight. What kind of culture are these individuals working in? How much pressure they have to fly to make money, to cut corners. So all of these things kind of conspired, if you will, to have not only this big increase in the number of operations, but a big increase in accidents, somewhat related to how these organizations operate. So the underlying problem, if you think about, helicopter EMS, it's really not unlike any other complex system. Human error is the number one issue in helicopter EMS. And we could say the same thing about general aviation, we could say the same thing about commercial aviation, or any kind of commercial aviation rather, as well as any type of industry out there. When we look at the accident record, by and large, it's a human error issue. And it really fell victim to the same thinking that other aviation operations were, is that when something went wrong, once we determined that it wasn't mechanical or an engineering failure, then we immediately start looking at the pilot. And so blame the pilot, blame the operation, without really looking at the system itself within which that operation exists. And the thing about that is it blinds us to the true nature of error that occurs within that system. So once we start blaming the pilot, blaming the person, we get away from the system itself and how that system generates failure. So, looking at it, and you can even see this in the NTSB reports, our tendency has been to describe the error, fatigue, pressure to fly, things like that. You're just describing at that point. You're not really understanding why it occurs, blaming the operator. And our typical fix has been increase the technology, more night vision goggles, autopilots, things like that. When that really doesn't seem to be the issue. We also kind of have a wait and see, put something in, we cross our fingers, hope it works. We wait to see what happens next. And then we can even see where we've kind of cherry picked the accidents. We go out and we find accidents that fit a particular narrative. And then we use those as a means for, if you will, fixing the system. But because of the complex nature of human behavior and human error, we have really lagged behind understanding it, certainly when we compare to our understanding of mechanical failure, which is far, far better. Our ability to understand mechanical failure, which is rooted in engineering and rooted in quantitative, in the quantitative aspects of analysis, gives us a wealth of information to address mechanical failure. That has really not been true with human error. So how do we go about addressing it? I'm sure everybody out there has heard of James Reason's Swiss cheese model, which describes the breakdown of a productive system, and where the holes in the cheese really are, what we would call failed or absent defenses. The great thing about it is it provided us with a new means to not only describe, but to think about and investigate human error. And if we look at his model here, we can see that Reason kind of envisioned it from a system standpoint, where at the very bottom, we have the unsafe acts, which are really the unsafe acts of the operators, pilots, mechanics, whoever it might be. And these are the individuals who are actively engaged in the operation. So in the case of helicopter EMS, obviously here we're talking about the pilots and flight crews. Prior to that though, and this quite frankly is where most of our accident investigations focus. We look at these unsafe acts and we make some kind of determination about what happened based upon them. Failing to scan instruments, penetrating weather, linear visual flight rules, forgetting an item on a checklist, whatever they might be. But as we can see, these are pilot-centric. Right above that, we have the preconditions for unsafe acts, and these preconditions really tell us about the state of the person, in this case, the pilot, or the state of the environment in which they're flying. So poor communication, loss of situational awareness, fatigue, mental stress, high workload, weather. So all of these describe the person or the environment. And then finally, we have the next two, which we rarely get to, unsafe supervision. If you think about it, latent conditions, like how well are your people trained? What does your training program look like? Poor mentorship, crew pairing, rotations that fatigue your pilots. Those all fall under supervision. Yet we rarely get to that point because it's a little bit tougher to track these things down. And then finally, at the very top, the organizational factors. And here you're going to have the things that really set the tone for how this system operates, how this system treats safety. So it's going to contain here things like your culture, how you utilize human resources, whether those resources be human resources or financial resources, cost cutting, pressure to make money. So all of those at the organization. And the thing about it is, when we look at it, down at the very bottom, which is where we tend to focus our investigation, it's also where we tend to focus our interventions, we call those local fixes. If I send a pilot who's made a mistake for more training, I fix that pilot. If I change the way my safety culture operates at the organizational level, that's a very broad fix, and we would call that a system-wide fix. So training one person is narrow and very specific. Instituting a new training program for everyone is broad-based and system-based, and that's really where we see our biggest benefits. So based on that, the human factors analysis and classification system really came behind reason and filled in those holes. And I'll go back here just to show, if I can. So each one of these holes are our failed or absent defenses. What reason did not do is tell us what those holes were. So when we say there's a failed defense here, what exactly does that mean? That's where the human factors analysis and classification system comes in. HFACs actually took those holes and filled them in. And it really serves two purposes. One, it gives us a way to think about human error. And two, it provides kind of a standardized language for us to talk about error in a system and how a system breaks down. So in the interest of time, I won't go through all of it, but I will just give you the overview. As you can see here, just like reason, we have at the very bottom our unsafe acts. And our unsafe acts these are the unsafe acts of the operators or the pilots, the flight crews. And you can see that the unsafe acts are broken down into two broad categories: errors, and an error is an honest mistake that a person makes. Violation is a person has done something wrong. They know they're doing it wrong, or they're doing something wrong, but they do it anyway. And the rest of the talk will focus on this bottom tier. So I'll briefly describe what each one of these are. Decision errors are just that. They are decisions that we make, a plan that we put in place that doesn't work out. And we typically make these because of, lack of information, lack of training, forethought, whatever it might be. So if we look at, go back. So if we look at, something like being in a hurry and deciding not to do a pre-flight, that'd be a violation. I'll get back to that. But thinking I have enough fuel to divert. So I take off to go from point A to point B, and I don't have, and I run into weather, and I look at my fuel, I check my burn rate, and I figure I have enough fuel to get to my alternate landing site, and along the way I'll run out of fuel. So that was a decision error. That was a plan that I had in place that didn't work out. Skill-based errors, these are what we would call in cognitive psychology an execution error. And so this will be forgetting things. You forget an item on a checklist. You forget to do something. We do this all the time. If you think about it, on the way home from work, I have 5 things to get from the store. And I say, well, I should write it down. But I'm like, no, I can remember 5 things. And of course I get there. And of course I've forgotten something. It's a skill-based error. And then finally, perceptual errors. Perceptual errors are just like the name implies. They typically occur in degraded environments, weather, dark night, but where our sensory systems are compromised, misjudging a runway, misjudging a landing site, or how close we are to a tree or a power line. Those are perceptual errors. Finally, routine violations. If we look at the violation side, routine violations or violations that occur all the time. Everybody does it. And the supervisor, the organization knows people are doing it, and they don't do anything about it. Good example of a routine violation. If I asked everyone in the room, if I was there, I would ask everyone, how many people, when you get on the interstate and the speed limit is 65, how many people actually drive 65? Most of us drive a little bit over. We kind of work that that 10-mile-an-hour cushion. And but we all do it. And the police know you're speeding, but they can't pull everybody over. As long as you're not driving aggressively, you'll probably be okay. That's a routine violation. And if you think about it, you know, we ask, why do people engage in routine violations at work and things like that? Saves money, saves time, saves effort. And so that's why they're tolerated. On the other hand, an exceptional violation is one that is not tolerated by the organization, and it's one you wouldn't expect of a person. You know, and this is, you know, flying in bad weather when you're not instrument rated, something like that. That would be an exceptional violation. Those are our unsafe acts. And notice we also have preconditions, unsafe supervision, and organizational influences. So basically did the same thing here, filled in those holes. And we can see under preconditions, environmental factors, condition of operators, personnel factors. So here we're describing what is the environment the person is working in. Tell me about the person. Tell me about their readiness, their personnel factors. So here we've kind of painted a picture of the environment and the individual. And then up here, the second from the top, unsafe supervision, where we have inadequate supervision, planned inappropriate operations, failing to correct known problems, and supervisory violations. And finally, under organizational influences, resource management, organizational climate, and organizational processes. So for the remainder of the talk, what I'm going to do is talk specifically about helicopter EMS, and I'm going to limit it to the bottom tier, the unsafe acts, knowing that there's more to the story. So up to this point, we've used HVACs in across aviation operations, U.S., civil, military, general aviation, you name it, we've done it. And what it's allowed us to do is talk about the types and frequencies of unsafe acts that are causing accidents, as well as look at some of these higher tiers as well. And the great thing here is it's also allowed us to make true comparisons to see, do we see differences across aviation operations? So EMS, beginning with data from 1990, what we really did here is we conducted a series of 3 investigations with HIMSS accidents. The first 2 used HVACs to classify the human error. The third investigation, however, was really based on those first 2. It involved a survey and a narrative questionnaire of HIMSS crews, really looking at specifically weather-related issues or weather-related issues that people found themselves in. And once I get through the first 2, I think you'll understand why we felt something like that was necessary. So in study 1, this was conducted when I was at the FAA. And to give you an idea of how we came by this, we analyzed all FAR Part 91, 121, 129, and 135 commercial aviation accidents, over 18,000 accidents between 1990 and 2000. We identified all those that were associated with aircrew error. We also looked at 15,000, and within there were 15,000 GA accidents, 30,000 human causal factors identified by the NTSB, 1,100 commercial accidents associated with 2,300 causal factors. Of those accidents, we identified 121 emergency medical accidents that were either classified as Part 91, which is general aviation, or Part 135, non-scheduled. Along with us, we had subject matter experts that were 7 pilots. All certified flight instructors also helped us to code this data. They all had an average number of flight hours of 3,500 hours. In order to really capture, though, a true HIMSS operation, what we did was we reduced that 121 to only those accidents that were occurring in what we call the rescue triangle, meaning that the helicopter was en route to pick up a patient, then they transporting that patient to a hospital, and then repositioning back to base. So what this didn't include were accidents that occurred, say on ferry flights, accidents that occurred, maintenance flights and things like that, or training flights. Only the rescue triangle. That reduced us to 74 accidents. And again, we're going to focus here on these unsafe acts. And this is kind of what we saw. Here are the accidents that we saw, and here's the accident rate. So, and this is per 100,000 hours of flight, 1990 to 2003. And what was certainly disconcerting to the FAA was this increase here in accidents that did not seem to be coming down. So here's what the distribution of unsafe acts look like. And this is not unlike other operations. We see far more skill-based errors, somewhere around 70%, which would make sense. You know, these are the things, these are errors and mistakes that happen in things that you do all the time. Followed by decision errors, a little bit better than 30%, perceptual, and then violations. But here was the breakdown. So under skill-based errors, these were clearance issues, poor control of the aircraft, not maintaining altitude or clearance, not looking outside of the helicopter. Decision errors, we saw things like in-flight planning and decision-making, whether that be fuel or weather, VFR, flight into IMC, not taking remedial action or going around. So this is typically going to be, looking for an alternate landing site, not going around if I'm in trouble. Perceptual errors, almost all of these were associated with weather, spatial disorientation, distance and altitude, visual illusion, and visual and oral detection. And then finally, under violations, procedures and directives not followed, VFR and a flight into IMC, so visual flight into weather, flight into known adverse weather. So all of the violations, for the most part, were weather-related violations. Here's what really, jumped out at us about the data. When you looked at the different classifications of errors, what you really saw is when a violation occurred, the likelihood of fatality being associated with it was much, much higher. So, in some cases, as much as 16 times more likely to have a violation occur or having a fatality occur when there was a violation involved. So what we gleaned from this was that violations were a particular problem with respect to survivability of an accident. Part of that was because it was weather related. Not surprisingly, we saw more accidents en route. So on the way to pick up the patient, fewer accidents transporting the patient during reposition. So how much of that is pressure to fly, hurrying up to get there, probably plays a role in that. And then fatalities by lighting condition. Not surprisingly, we saw about double the number of fatalities, the percentage of fatalities at night versus daytime. And more accidents in the daytime though. Fatalities related to weather condition, way more fatalities in weather versus visual flight rules. And not surprising, because what you're going to see in weather was exactly what we expected. You see much more control flight into terrain or control flight into obstacle, which really most of those or very little survivability from those types of accidents. Accidents that are occurring in daytime, many of those had to do with dynamic rollovers, dust ups, and things like that. That while they're certainly destroy the hull of a helicopter, don't necessarily result in fatalities. And like I was saying, CFIT related to environmental condition, CFIT into obstacle about the same, whether the conditions are clear or impoverished. Same thing for not CFIT, but then when you look at CFIT into terrain, and CFIT into terrain or into water, because some of these that occurred over water, much, much greater incidence of that when the weather is bad, either rain, snow, dark night, that kind of thing. And CFIT related to fatalities, here's the actual data. So very few people survive CFIT into terrain. We just don't see that. And that was very clear in this data. So a true problem for helicopter EMS. So based upon that, I had a graduate student who was interested in the same topic when I moved to Riddle, and he wanted to kind of continue that, that line of thinking. He pulled out a number of accidents, or he looked at all the helicopter EMS accidents from 2000 to 2012. Basically the idea to extend the study. And he looked at a number of other factors. I won't report all of them here because they're not really germane to what we're talking about, but I can give you a little bit of an idea of what he found and what he kind of made of it. So total of 147 accidents here. So, and during that time, we had a big increase in the number of helicopter EMS operations. So he was really looking at a lot more accidents coded by a 3-person panel, all trained in HVACs, all consensus coded. So the data here doesn't look a whole lot different. You see a lot of consistency, and that's what we wanted to point out. More accidents transiting or en route to pick up the patient, just like we found in the other study. A few more accidents landing at the patient site. And, you know, and you can kind of see the breakdown in fatalities taking off from the patient site. So if you really look at that first one, if you look at all of those accidents in the type, transiting to the patient site, landing at the patient site, and transiting to home base, those were, you know, accounted for the bulk of those accidents. Those were the big offenders. Under fatalities, transiting to the patient site, we see that same thing. 14 fatal accidents there, 11 transiting to the hospital, and then 13 transiting to home base. And then finally, when we look at the involvement of human error, out of those 147, 101 of those were designated as or identified by the NTSB as having human error as a root and a central cause to that accident. So when we break it down by decision error, we look at that bottom tier. We can kind of look where all those accidents group together. We see that, you know, again, skill-based error here in those blue bars, by far the most common. So just like we saw before, more skill-based errors. However, what did change here was greater perceptual errors. So they identified more perceptual errors compared to the general analysis that we saw there, where we found more decision errors. Third was decision errors, and then finally violations here. The other thing that stood out that was really different was looking at fatalities. So more fatalities and perceptual errors, followed by skill-based and then violations. So what really stood out here, more perceptual errors, which really told us that what we're seeing was more, you know, more weather-related issues, more environmental-related impacts, weather, dark night, those types of conditions, where those sensory systems are degraded. And then we can look at how we broke down our rescue triangle, if you will. The accidents at pickup and landing, you see more skill-based errors and perceptual errors. So pickup crews back to the hospital, we see more skill-based errors and then violations, weather, and then finally home crews, more perceptual errors. So a little bit different, but this is what really stuck out for us, the fatalities and the perceptual errors. Natural lighting conditions. If you look, dawn and daylight, dark night was a factor in over half of the accidents that happened at night. And obviously much of this is in rural areas where you don't have a lot of ambient light, you don't have a lot of light from cityscapes and things like that. So that tended to impact those individuals. So over half dark night. And that's really our, when we look at, how we classify this, daylight, dawn, dusk, daylight, we have the bulk, because obviously you have more helicopters operating at this time. But dark night, by far the most, and night unspecified. And when we say unspecified here, what we're really referring to is that the NTSB did not distinguish, or we could not distinguish from the report or research what the nighting conditions were like. So based on that, what we saw, those two studies, we really understood that what we were dealing with, whether we looked at perceptual errors, whether we looked at violations, it was really weather seemed to be the big toxic component in helicopter EMS. Dealing with weather, whether it's from the pilot's side or not, it doesn't matter, but this is something that they have to deal with. So what we wanted to do was look at, approach this from a little bit of a different perspective. And that is, rather than just looking at accidents, because obviously that's a retrospective, doesn't really help us moving. It helps us somewhat moving forward. But what we really wanted to look at were close calls. We wanted to, talk to pilots and find out, tell us about times you had trouble, weather-related trouble. So to do that, we developed a survey specifically geared towards helicopter EMS professionals, and in this case, pilots and flight crews, meaning paramedics, nurses, etc. And its intent was to look specifically at these weather-related incidents. We didn't want to look at crashes. We wanted to look at those close calls that people have, that all pilots have when they're flying, specifically those related to weather. So to do that, we sent this out to all helicopter EMS pilots. We had 171 HIMSS professionals that answered our survey. 75 of those pilots and one flight paramedic completed the narratives. And we had over 81 narratives because some had more than one. And so you can kind of see the breakdown here. By far, most of them were pilots, some flight nurses, paramedic, and chief pilots. So, and that's really what we wanted. We wanted to get mainly from the pilot perspective. So our survey instrument had 52 items. We developed it in conjunction with a meteorologist here at Embry-Riddle, a certified flight instructor, 3 human factors professionals, and 1 Coast Guard helicopter rescue pilot. The questions included demographics, where you operate, how long you've been flying, things like that, a number of operational items, the geographic location, and specifically we had 3 items on there that asked the participants to describe up to 3 incidents where they unintentionally entered instrument meteorological conditions. And so here's what we kind of saw geographically. Most of the operations were, or we had a large percentage of them were in rural, many of them urban and metro, and then non-metro frontier, which is really out there. Some of these are from Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, and then mountainous regions. So that's just kind of a breakdown of where people are operating. And we also asked the pilots to give us some information about the ratings. So multi-engine, most of them, all of them commercial. So these are just the ratings, some air transport pilot, instrument ratings, CFI, CFI2. So all of our pilots well rated. We also wanted to get a sense of what type of operation they had. Were they hospital-based or independent? And as you can see, it was split about evenly. So roughly 50% of them, about 51% were based solely out of hospital, and about 49% were independent. We asked if they operated IFR certified aircraft, meaning can your aircraft, is it certified to fly in weather? A little less than 50% were not. So when you look at that distribution, and this of course is kind of troubling to us, because if you look at the accident rate and you look at the accidents that are occurring, particularly the serious ones, weather is a big issue, yet only about 50% of the aircraft operating we're actually flying weather certified aircraft. Not surprisingly, only a couple of the respondents operated with dual pilots. The vast majority in this country are single, which really separates us from a lot of other countries, certainly Europe and Canada, where the operations are dual pilot. Most employed some type of enhanced vision systems. And again, this was a recommendation by the FAA some years ago, and the NTSB. And also only about a little better than half were equipped with some type of terrain avoidance system, and only a little better than half equipped with weather radar. So again, we're kind of seeing, you know, when we start talking about what are the systemic issues associated with these accidents, particularly the fatalities, we're kind of starting to get a sense here of what those systemic issues are. And, you know, so rather than just saying, well, you know, the pilot did this, pilot did that, we're actually seeing here's what the pilots are having to deal with. So top 5 incident categories, like you may have expected. Number 1, pressure to fly. So most felt, so in these, and these are from the narratives, so in those instances where pilots found themselves in trouble, what we were really asking was what got you there? And number 1 on the list was pressure to fly, financial, organizational, or other. Lack of weather equipment. So either aircraft not being certified, not having radar on board, darkness, terrain, and lack of preparation. But those first 2 really stood out to us. Time of day conditions, no surprise here, the vast majority of them occurred at night. So, so now we get a sense, not only, you know, going after, you know, the accidents, but hey, what are you guys actually dealing with? What does it look like when you have a problem? Phase of flight when it's occurring, this jives very well with what we saw before. The bulk of them en route and then on site with patient pickup. And also en route, a lot of them specifically pointed out a lack of or unavailable weather information along the way, and on site at patient pickup as well. And I think to understand this is understand that a lot of these operations, or many of them, are working outside of radar coverage. And so what you're seeing here for some of them is they may see a weather system moving in and figure I have an hour to get out, meaning I have, you know, 20, 25 minutes to get there. If I spend, you know, 10 minutes on the ground and I'm up and coming back, I should be okay. Problem with it is a lot of times you spend way more time on the ground than that. And by that point, the weather's closing in. And so now it's a race to get back, or it's a race to get there. So that's kind of what we're seeing there. So all of these things really kind of underscored what we saw with our HFACS analysis. So what does this all mean? Well, when we look at it, and look at those first 2 investigations, 1 and 2, what we see is that they really don't differ from other aviation platforms when you look at those unsafe acts. More skill-based errors, more decision errors, perceptual errors, and violations. So, but once you dig a little deeper and look at those fine-grained analyses, what we see is that we have an inordinate number of those accidents or involving degraded conditions, and that's particularly true for violations and perceptual errors. And that's whether those degraded conditions are dark night, whether it's snow or rain or whatever, some type of weather system, they seem to be dealing with this on a fairly consistent basis. The relationship between unsafe acts and fatalities really showed us where violations and perceptual errors set those types of accidents apart from skill-based errors and decision errors. So this really gives us an area to kind of focus our attention in terms of moving this forward. How do we really come up with, where do we focus our efforts in terms of interventions to address some of these problems? Same thing, we look at position and phase of flight. Majority of the accidents are occurring during en route and transport. And that's particularly true at the accident site, where we saw a number of approach, landing, and maneuvering issues. Takeoff and climb out accounted for 45% of the total accidents. So just taking off and climbing out from the accident site. When lighting and weather conditions are taken into considerations, fatalities are much more likely to occur at night and in weather. So fairly, once you kind of look at it and break it down, it's fairly straightforward. And like we say, the most compelling data we really saw from study 1 was the relationship between fatalities and controlled flight into terrain or obstacles. In particular, when we look at the CFIT accidents from that first study, there were 9 classified as CFIT by the NTSB. All but one of those involved a fatality. And so we can really see here, the human toll that this is taking. We found similar things in study 2. And finally, in our third study, which perhaps given all of the work and research that had been done prior to this, we found really disturbing, terrain avoidance systems and onboard weather radar. Those are the basics that you need to fly where you have the potential to be in degraded weather. Yet roughly 50% of the operations out there, a little less than that, were not so equipped. Lack of aircraft to fly in degraded weather. 98% of our sample, not surprisingly, reported single pilot operations, despite the fact that we know from other countries that employ helicopter EMS and from our own Coast Guard and other operations here, how important it is to have that second pilot. Lack of weather reporting was also an issue, particularly during en route and on-site phases. And the pilots themselves stated that these phases were perhaps the most problematic, along with the pressure to fly, which really comes, fits within that, the monetization of this industry, where people have to fly to make money. Recommendations and considerations, here's just a few, from that. Number 1, and it's not on here, a fully implemented safety management system. Having a way to track, just like we did with that third study, tracking the incidents and the errors that are people making, so you know how your system is performing. That's critical. Terrain avoidance warning systems and onboard weather radar. Increasing coverage of weather reporting stations, especially in those areas where weather is a real problem, where you have very fast shifts in weather patterns. IFR currency, instrument currency, and not only currency, but proficiency for the air crew and IFR equipment in the aircraft. So it's not enough to be, to be certified, you have to be proficient. Enhanced vision systems. I mean, many of them are using enhanced vision systems now, but even though this was cited as a real problem 15 years ago, as we can see, it really hasn't addressed the core problem. Crew resource management, in particular for on-scene and ground personnel. It's important that those people calling in helicopters understand, number 1, where a helicopter can land and how much room that helicopter needs to take off once it's landed. Is the ground too soft? Is it too much dust where the pilot may lose ground reference on landing? Wires, trees, all that stuff needs to be taken into consideration. That should be standard training for ground personnel. Dual crew, dual engine aircraft has been shown to be effective in other countries. Comprehensive study of the system within which HIMSS operates. And finally, redefining the operational theory for HIMSS operations, i.e., when do we call them out? When is it truly necessary? The morbidity and mortality is not improved for adults who are transported by helicopter. That has been shown time and time again. It does for children with head injuries, but for the most part, we don't see a real benefit for a lot of the people who are transported by helicopter. And so when we look at that risk-benefit ratio, it really doesn't hold up for a large portion of those individuals being transported. So that's kind of a brief and fire hose tour of helicopter EMS and kind of some of the work that we've done in it. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I can certainly, you have my contact information. Again, I apologize I was not able to be there in person, but you're certainly free to email me. My contact information is there. Good luck, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the time there.